Saint Francis of Assisi is one of the most celebrated saints in history. This rebel with a cause was a rich kid from 13th century Italy who kick-started the Franciscan orders, which remain among the most influential in Catholicism today. Yet, Francis himself had an extraordinary riches-to-rags story, a party animal turned peacemaker, the son of a merchant who became a mystic who first bore the wounds of Christ. Think stealing from his father to rebuild a church is wild? How about preaching to birds or debating a sultan on faith in the midst of a crusade? See, this isn't your ordinary saint story. This is about a man who challenged the church, preached to animals, and sparked a spiritual revolution. This is the story of Saint Francis of Assisi. Italy, 1181. The Assisi household was abuzz, not just with the cries of a newborn, but with the thrill of a homecoming. Pica di Bourlemont, a noblewoman from Provence, had just given birth to a son, while her husband, Bernardone de Moriccioni, a wealthy silk merchant, had just returned from France with pockets lined with gold. He'd been away on business, you see, striking deals and expanding his silk empire between Venice and France. In his absence, Pica had named the child Giovanni after John the Baptist, but Bernardone, with his head full of French fancies and overflowing coffers, declared, "He shall be Francesco, a Frenchman in the making, an heir to his fortune." That's what he wanted. And so, Francis he became. Growing up, Francis was the epitome of privilege. Fine clothes, extravagant parties, the hottest troubadour tunes. He had it all. He was Assisi's original party boy, the life of every feast, the king of the social scene. And his father, well, he didn't mind one bit. He saw it as an investment, grooming his son to take over the family business to become a merchant prince. But beneath the surface of silk and revelry, a different kind of yearning was taking root in Francis's soul. A restlessness, a hunger for something more than endless banquets and frivolous pursuits. Honor. That's what he craved. The glory of knighthood, the thrill of a battle. So, around 1202, he joined a military expedition against Perugia, decked out in armor, dreaming of valor and victory. But reality had other plans. The battle was a disaster, his battalion crushed. Francis, captured, spent a year as a prisoner of war. Now, some say this imprisonment was a turning point, time of reflection and re-evaluation, but by all accounts, Francis remained his cheerful, optimistic self, and when he finally returned to Assisi in 1203, he simply picked up where he had left off, partying like there was no tomorrow. So what could possibly shake this incorrigible reveler, the spoiled Prince of Assisi, from his life of luxury and laughter? What could possibly pierce the bubble of privilege and awaken a soul destined for greatness? Underneath his unstoppable mirth, there were changes taking place. That desire for glory and conquest hinted at a deeper longing, a sense that life held more meaning than simply wealth and fleeting pleasures. It slowly dawned on him that purpose was what he craved. So, when in 1205 the Count of Brienne called for holy warriors to fight in the Fourth Crusade, Francis felt a spark. This was it, his chance to find meaning, to fight for a cause greater than himself. Imagine him finally ready to embark on a holy quest, armor gleaming and heart ablaze. But once more, fate had other plans. Only one day's ride from Assisi, he fell desperately ill. Fever racked his body, visions danced before his eyes. In that delirious state, a fear gripped him, the fear of a wasted life spent chasing these empty pleasures. He cried out for God, begging for forgiveness, pleading for guidance. And then it happened. A vision, more vivid than any fever dream. The clouds parted, a voice boomed like thunder. "Francis, everything you have loved and desired in the flesh, it is your duty to despise and hate, if you wish to know my will. All that now seems sweet and lovely to you will become intolerable and bitter, but all that you used to avoid will turn itself to great sweetness and exceeding joy." He had received a message that he should obey the Maker and not the man. He realized his destiny was not to die in battle, but that he had a mission he must discover. Sheepish, But overjoyed, he rode home to Assisi a new man. The first thing Francis realized was that his wealth was worthless if it wasn't serving the church. But how could he make that his main quest while stuck running fetch quests for his father? He wandered the rolling hills of central Italy searching for answers, wrestling with his purpose. Then, one day, he encountered a weary traveller who sparked a series of events he could never take back. See, in medieval Europe, much like Roman Judea, beggars were the lowest of the low. But beneath them, outcasts among outcasts, were the lepers. These were the truly unfortunate, afflicted with a horrifying disease that slowly rotted their flesh, leaving them disfigured and isolated. Imagine Francis strolling through the Perugian hills, lost in thought, when suddenly he comes face to face with one of these lepers. Most would recoil in disgust, but not Francis. Compassion flooded his soul, washing away fear. Remembering Jesus' own embrace of the lepers, he reached out and did the unthinkable. This radical act of love was a turning point that shattered his old life. The emptiness of his former life became unbearable, and the call to a spiritual life became irresistible. He began visiting hospitals, praying for the sick, even venturing into leper colonies to pray with them, hold their hands and eat with them, and even wear their clothes in an act of radical humility. His father watched in growing frustration as Francis abandoned his lavish lifestyle and gave away his money. But the biggest break was yet to come. Francis, using what savings he had left, embarked on a pilgrimage to Rome for clarity and direction. But amidst the grandeur of the Roman capital, he found no solace. Instead, he traded his fine clothes for the rags of a beggar outside the papal gates and joined them in begging, humbling himself to experience true poverty. He spent days wandering lonely places, praying at forgotten shrines and crumbling churches, until he stumbled upon the derelict monastery at San Damiano. This once grand structure was now a shadow of its former self, barely maintained by a handful of priests. But for Francis, it was perfect. He retreated to this forgotten corner of Rome, praying ceaselessly, seeking God's will. Prostrate before the cross, he heard a voice, and looking up, saw Jesus himself speaking from the crucifix. "Francis, Francis, repair my church." In his humility, and taking the vision quite literally, Francis immediately rode to his father's warehouses. He counted 1/3 of the cloth, sold it at a bargain price, and brought the money as an offering to San Damiano for its reconstruction. The monks there were, however, horrified once they heard where the money had come from and refused to accept it, declaring that God will provide. Unsurprisingly, this led to a dramatic confrontation with his father. Francis was forced to renounce his family name, his inheritance, his entire former life, embracing Lady Poverty as his bride. Though he kept the name Francis, one wonders if he felt a kinship with his namesake, John the Baptist, as he wandered the countryside in rough-spun clothes, begging alongside the homeless. His family and friends were aghast, but Francis was undeterred. He was a man on a mission, driven by an unwavering commitment to follow Christ in a life of radical simplicity. He begged for stones and rebuilt San Damiano with his bare hands, brick by brick, driven by a burning desire to serve God, ceasing only once the work was completed. Little did he know, his true work was just beginning. Gradually, a small group began to form around Francis, drawn to his radical lifestyle. These weren't curious onlookers, these were men and women ready to give it all up, to sleep under the stars, to share scraps with the poor, and love God with every fiber of their being. Francis, the man of action, knew this ragtag band needed some direction. So he did what any good medieval mystic would do. He opened the Bible, at random, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And what did he find? First, the story of the rich young man challenged to sell all he has and give to the poor. Then, the command for the apostles to travel light, taking nothing for their journey. And finally, the call to take up the cross daily. "These are our rules," Francis declared. Simple, yet utterly radical. How radically, you might ask? Well, he even had one brother chase down a thief who stole his hood just to offer him the whole robe as well. The truth is that though Francis never intended to start a religious order, this former knight thought that sounded too militaristic after all, he saw it as a community of equals expressing God's brotherhood, bound by love and service. His companions were a motley crew: farmers, scholars, nobles, merchants, all united in their desire to follow Christ in radical poverty. Almost unique to the Franciscans, though, was that this wasn't just about human brotherhood. Francis extended that love to all creation. He saw God's presence in every creature, from the tiniest sparrow to the fiercest wolf. He often practiced his sermons by preaching to birds who were said to have listened, rapt. He even had a favourite falcon who used to perch and listen as he chatted away. But the greatest hit must have been when he heard of a village struggling with a violent man-eating wolf. While the village had taken up arms to go and hunt the beast, Francis prayed that it would come to him. When it did trot up, he calmed it with a few gentle words and made a pact promising food and protection in exchange for peace. It turned into the village sweetheart, eating only what the villagers provided. This guy's connection with nature had hardly been seen since Adam and Eve in the garden, and was one of the major considerations in his posthumous veneration. These barefoot brothers, clad in rags, took to the streets preaching the gospel 2 by 2. At first, people were hostile, even terrified. But something about their joy and genuine love was irresistible. Soon, those who once threw mud were greeting them with open arms. Indeed, Francis didn't try to abolish poverty, he made it holy. If they met someone poorer than themselves, they'd rip off their clothes to give to them. They worked for their food, begged only when necessary, and refused to touch money. Francis called coins pebbles, worthless in the face of the true riches of the kingdom of heaven. This radical simplicity extended to everything Francis did. When he wanted approval for his brotherhood, he marched straight to Pope Innocent III. Can you imagine this beggar approaching the most powerful man in Christendom? The Pope, unsurprisingly, threw him out. But then he had a dream. Francis, tiny and ragged, holding up the crumbling Lateran Basilica. Divine intervention? The Pope thought so. He called Francis back and gave him permission to preach. Francis was a man of action, driven by his heart. He made mistakes, sure, but he corrected them with the same passion and humility. Once he ordered a stuttering brother to preach half naked, thinking it would cure his anxiety. But as soon as he realized his cruelty, he ran to town, stopped the brother, stripped off his own clothes, and preached in his place. This is how the Franciscan order was born, out of radical love, joyful service, and a deep connection with God and all creation. Surprisingly, it became a wildfire that spread across Europe, challenging the church, empowering the poor, and breathing a breath of fresh air to a world suffocating in wealth and corruption. Yet, as the Crusades became increasingly bloody, Francis soon sensed the order faced a demand for a new direction. As Jesus once said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Yeah, Francis wasn't just about preaching to birds and embracing lepers. This guy had a global vision, a burning desire to bring peace to a world consumed by conflict. The coalition of nations running the Fifth Crusade had started to fracture, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem had come under increasing strain. Francis, the radical, believed in a different kind of crusade, a crusade of love and reconciliation. He sent out missionaries across Christendom to bend the ears of rulers and pray for peace while he himself set out to the Holy Land. His first attempts were, well, let's just say they didn't go as planned. Shipwrecked on the way to Syria, sneaking back to Italy as a stowaway, not exactly a glorious start. He even tried going through Spain, but got sick and had to turn back. Still, our guy didn't give up. In 1219, he finally made it to the Holy Land, landing smack dab in the middle of the Fifth Crusade. The Crusaders were besieging Damietta, a city in Egypt, and the whole scene was chaos, blood, violence, and a whole lot of unholy behavior. Francis, appalled by the carnage, decided to do what Francis does, take the most direct approach imaginable. He marched straight into the enemy camp with just one companion and called out, "Sultan! Sultan!" The guards, probably wondering at the sanity of this barefoot Christian, brought him before the Sultan al-Kamil. Francis, bold as brass, declared, "I'm here to show you the way to salvation." In a major act of interfaith dialogue, the Sultan decided to have a real chat about the faiths and the war. In his insistence that Christianity was the true faith, Francis even offered to walk into a fire with the Sultan's imams to see who would be burned up. The Sultan politely declined, noting he wasn't sure any imams would volunteer, and that if he converted, they would both have to be killed by law anyway. This encounter, though short, was a powerful witness to peace and interfaith dialogue. It wasn't entirely successful. The Sultan did not convert, and the war raged on, but Al-Kamil was deeply impressed by Francis. He gave him permission to travel freely throughout the Holy Land and even preach there. Francis was able to finally realize his dream of walking in the footsteps of Jesus, praying at the holy sites, and spreading his message of peace. And get this, thanks to Francis's bold move, the Franciscans have had a continuous presence in the Holy Land ever since. They're still there today, guardians of the holy places, witnesses to peace and reconciliation, even in the midst of conflict. Francis returned to an order that had exploded in his absence. Friars were popping up everywhere like a holy wildfire, from Italy to France, Germany, Hungary, and even Spain. The church was concerned that they were trying to manage thousands of barefoot friars with just a simple rule and a whole lot of passion. It was a losing battle. Enter Cardinal Ugolino, the Pope's appointed babysitter for the Franciscans. He was all about rules, regulations, and keeping things in order. Francis, bless his rebellious heart, wasn't thrilled. He saw it as a betrayal of his radical vision. But even Francis realized that the order needed a firmer foundation. Just a few short years after his return from the Holy Land, he stepped down as leader, handing the reins to more practical minds. It was a bittersweet moment that marked a decisive end to much of the simplicity that had come before. It was a kind of martyrdom for Francis, a surrender of his authority, but in true Franciscan spirit, he embraced it with humility and grace, knowing that all authority belonged to God. He retreated to the mountains, seeking solace in prayer and solitude. Still, if all this wasn't enough for sainthood, the most definitive miracle was yet to come. In his final 2 years of life, Francis knew the curtain was falling. His body, weathered by years of poverty and penance, was failing him, but his spirit, that was blazing brighter than ever. At Christmas time in Greccio, a tiny village nestled in the Italian hills, Francis decided to stage the world's first ever nativity scene, a real-life stable complete with manger, hay, and even a donkey and an ox. He wanted to bring the story of Christ's birth to life, to make it real for the villagers. And guess what? That tradition is now a Christmas staple for millions the world over. But even as Francis brought joy to others, his own light was dimming. An incurable infection ravaged his eyelids, stealing his sight. He endured painful treatments, but to no avail. Blindness descended, yet even in darkness and pain, Francis never stopped singing God's praises. He saw the world with spiritual eyes, a world bathed in divine light. Then, during a 40-day fast, deep in prayer, Francis received his final and most extraordinary vision. A seraph, an angel with 6 fiery wings, appeared before him nailed to a cross. Francis felt an intense pain in his hands, his feet, and his side. When the vision faded, he found himself marked with the stigmata, the very wounds of Christ. Now, most people would freak out, right? Especially as this was the first recorded stigmata in history, but not Francis. He saw it as a profound union with his Savior, a physical manifestation, a reminder of his deep love for Christ. He didn't boast or show off these sacred wounds. He humbly concealed them, sharing them only with a select few, his doctors and the authorities. After treatments failed, Francis returned to Assisi to prepare for his final bow. It was there, in his beloved city, that he composed one of his most beautiful works, the Canticle of the Sun. It's a song of praise, a celebration of all creation. On his deathbed, Francis sang his canticle, his voice weak but filled with joy. He glorified his Creator, ready to return to the source of all love. His final words echoed Psalm 141, cry of surrender, a plea for release from earthly bonds. Francis asked for a pauper's burial, a simple grave in the criminal's cemetery. But the people of Assisi knew better. They recognized the saint in their midst, the man who had transformed their city, their church, and their world. They carried his body to the Church of St. George, where it lay in state, honored and beloved. Just 2 years after his death, the church officially recognized what everyone already knew. Francis was a saint. A magnificent basilica rose in his honor, but his tomb, in a final act of humility, was hidden deep beneath the basilica. It's because of this extraordinary story of self-denial, radical love, joyful service, and unwavering faith, the Franciscan order remains one of the most powerful in the world today. He was a rebel, a mystic, a lover of all creation. And his legacy? Well, the Franciscan order is still going strong. Christians of all stripes celebrate Francis. His life is a shining example of what it means to follow Christ. He inspires us to protect the environment, to work for peace, and to see God's presence in everyone and everything. So what can we learn from St. Francis? Simple. Love changes everything. When love is at the center, Jesus is glorified. And that's why St. Francis, the little poor man of Assisi, deserves his place in God's holy histories.